Thank you for joining us for Zona Abierta, which is we're presenting in partnership with three other entities, the UIC Freshwater Lab, the Global Learning Community, and the Little Village Environmental Justice Organization known as LVEJO. For some of you who don't know about Zona Abierta, it's one of our program series which highlights the intersection between the arts, the humanities, science, culture, and civic life. And this is done with presentation from local, national, and even international artists, scholars, and community leaders about pressing social issues affecting the life of Latino Americans, and making connections across community, especially here in Chicago. This space has a very rich history of bringing people together. Next year will be our 40th anniversary. And if you look around, the mural depicts a lot of social issues that were very pressing during the 1990s. Today, these issues has a lot of relevancy. Unfortunately, we're still dealing with a lot of these social and environmental challenges affecting our communities. For example, if you look to your right here, you will see that this scenery here deals with immigration, the immigration story, and questioning the American dream. And it also depicts the monarch butterfly as a symbolism of the monarch crossing borders between Mexico and the United States, just as humans do that. But we also talk a lot about spaces and the right to have a specific cultural spaces on campus and community that help people affirm their identity. And lately, the last couple of years, we have been integrating environmental and climate justice in a lot of the work that we do. So the mural towards the back also have some scenery that help us bring people together on dialogue about this particular issue. In today's presentation called Environmental Justice in the Little Village Community, we will hear about the work of LVEJO addressing environmental inequalities such as the 31st Street Collateral Channel, which is a highly contaminated waterway located next to the new Villita Park, right? And also about the work of the UIC Freshwater Lab. How many of you are familiar with the UIC Freshwater Lab? A few of you, okay, wonderful. So you will be, I think we all will learn a lot about what this particular project is doing and how it links to the work that LVEJO is doing. Before I introduce our speakers and our dialogue facilitator, I would like to thank the co-sponsors for this program, the UIC Latino American and Latino Studies Program, the Office of Sustainability, and student organizations, Heritage Garden Student Group. There is a few of the interns here today. Raise your hands, please. Great, thank you. International Club. Where is International Club? Mexican Students de Aztlán. Where are you? Okay, so a couple of people back there. And the Union of Puerto Rican Students. And I always like to highlight them because this is one way that we work with a lot of student organizations, and they take leadership in helping us the day of the event with different tasks that are going on. I would also like to thank CAN TV for taping this program, which will be cablecast on CAN TV and their YouTube page. And the best way to find out when this is going to be aired is by checking their website. So if any of you is uncomfortable being taped today, you might want to move to the back because everybody will probably show up in the tape. So just so that you know. Our guest speaker, I would like to introduce him now. His name is Antonio Reyes Lopez. He's the executive director of LVEJO. Dr. Reyes Lopez has written extensively on anti-poverty and anti-racist social movements in Chicago, and has contributed to human rights, environmental justice, and economic justice struggles in Chicago and on the U.S.-Mexico border. After his presentation, he will be joined by Kellen Marshall. Where is Kellen? On the back. Who is a doctoral student in ecology at UIC, researching the impact of pollution on Chicago urban agriculture and collaborating with the UIC Freshwater Lab project. Just a little bit about the UIC Freshwater Lab. This is a project that is supported by a global Midwest grant from the Humanities with a World Consortium, based at the Illinois Program for Research in the Humanities at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. The 15-member consortium, which includes the UIC Institute for the Humanities, is funded by a grant from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. The project is exploring creative approaches to the social, economic, and political issues of water management in the Great Lakes region. So, with further ado, I would like to welcome Antonio, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be back here at the Latino Cultural Center here at UIC. As you were referencing the beautiful art here, it struck me that how the environment and land and water is always a central component of our people's aesthetic work and cultural work. And I had the chance to be in New York, the privilege to be in New York and check out the Jacob Lawrence Great Migration series, and of which we'll be going into the 100-year commemoration of the tremendous migration of African peoples to northern cities. And there too was tremendous references to land and water and people's connections to the land, and how oftentimes that's been a struggle as they've moved to urban areas. But still, we kind of try to make those connections. As Kellen was reminding me earlier about those deep connections that we still have and need to preserve. I also want to start out by thanking the UIC Latino Cultural Center and Mario and Rosa and the Freshwater Lab and Professor Rachel Haverlock, the UIC Institute for Humanities, and UIC Global Learning Community for having me here to talk today. It's really a great moment to open a space like this, and given that just recently we've gotten news of the Keystone Pipeline being stopped, important news, and we have, yeah, we can clap for that. And all of the, I think, in our field and doing environmental work and environmental justice work, it's just such an important moment right now with the Clean Power Plan, and now that I think folks are beginning to really give some deep thought to climate change and the climate crisis and the extractive economies that have done so much damage to our planet and our societies. So I'm going to go maybe a roundabout way to getting to the collateral channel, but we'll get there. And so I want to talk a little bit first about, give some opening remarks, and then talk about the work that we've been doing to develop an environmental justice and sustainability plan, and that's what brought us into contact with the Freshwater Lab. And then I think the plan is then to open it up for me and Kellen to kind of sit down together and build a nice conversation and interact with the audience. And I think that's the best way to convey the work that we do and how we like to work. So for the past 3 years, I've had the privilege of serving as the executive director of LVEJO. And so by the way of opening remarks, it's really appropriate to mention that LVEJO is only one organization in the citywide, regional, national, and global struggle for environmentally safe livelihoods and political, economic, and cultural liberation. In Chicago alone, there are incredible leaders and several neighborhood environmental justice organizations that share our values. LVEJO is proud to be a member of the Chicago EJ Network alongside Blacks in Green, Peoples for Community Recovery, the Pilsen Environmental Rights and Reform Organization, and the Southeast Environmental Task Force. So how many folks here have heard about like the struggle against pet coke, maybe? Have you heard about that? And these are incredible organizations that are doing work around that, around high asthma rates. How many folks here have, either yourself or your family members are dealing with asthma? right? These are, this is a huge issue, particularly I think children with asthma, right? It's such a tough issue, and then just unexplainable cancers in our communities, in our families, and also folks that are dealing with a lot of diesel emissions and thinking about transit and transportation. So we're only one organization amongst many that are really trying to address this from a neighborhood level, and that's what I would emphasize about us. We are a neighborhood-based environmental justice organization. So LVEJO has existed for 20 years, and that's certainly an accomplishment for a small neighborhood-based organization. However, we take our cues and inspiration from the struggles of indigenous communities and communities of color that have waged their resistance to colonial and corporate domination for centuries. In other words, LVEJO's contribution to the environmental justice movement is rooted in historical struggles for life, dignity, self-determination, and survival. And I believe there may be, perhaps, Rachel, we passed out the EJ principles, or they're there in the back for you to grab a paper that really outlines the kind of core principles of the environmental justice movement, of which issues like self-determination and economic, political, and cultural liberation are at the center of what it means to do environmental justice work. So in Chicago, LVEJO is also located in and serves the largest Mexican community in the region. Often referred to as the Mexican capital of the Midwest, La Vita remains an anchor immigrant community in the city. Anybody from La Vita here in the house? Oh yeah, there we go. All right, that's what's up. Nice to have you here. And unlike many neighborhoods that have been overwhelmed by gentrification and the hyper-consumption culture that has emerged in this society, La Vita is culturally wealthy and has a thriving formal and informal economy driven by generations of border crossers who have arrived to Chicago from distant locations. So LVEJO is a contributor to this dynamic community, and we are also a reflection of this dynamic community, as we have learned so much about resiliency and environmental justice from our neighbors, elders, and youth leaders. LVEJO is respected for our grassroots efforts and community-based victories that have resulted in concrete benefits for the neighborhood. We've spent years working to shutter down the Fisk and Crawford coal power plants, to create desperately needed open space by transitioning a Superfund site into a new public park, and to reestablish public bus services in our neighborhood. Unfortunately, the benefits of these environmental justice victories are currently threatened by three major forces. One are local politicians and planning and development projects that severely lack in environmental justice and health analysis. The second is federal and state environmental legislation, such as the Clean Power Plan, that could potentially allow emission increases in our communities. And three, there are powerful forces of gentrification and displacement that threaten to remove longtime residents from the community. So due to these forces, LVEJO has become proactive in working on an environmental justice and community rootedness plan. Mindful of the fraught history of planning in this city and our own limitations as a nonprofit organization, we still feel compelled to ensure that our community does not continue to endure the disproportionate impact of pollution and contamination. We've worked hard to build a healthier community, and we are committed to ensuring that these improvements are enjoyed for the longtime residents of the neighborhood, not another population. I wanted to start with those opening remarks to give you a sense of how we're part of a broader alliance and movement, a broader environmental justice movement that really spans the globe. And also to say that before I talk to you about like our mission, and I could have just started and said, here's our mission statement, this is what we do. But to actually, I think it gives a context to why we have the types of things in our sustainability plan, but also what our mission statement means to us. Does that make sense? So this is really important work. Little Village is a very important community with a strong environmental justice legacy. So the mission of LVEJO is to organize with our community to accomplish environmental justice in Little Village and achieve the self-determination of immigrant, low-income, and working-class families So there's, in Chicago, there's a lot of social service organizations. They do wonderful and very urgent work in low-income communities, communities of color. We're actually not a social service agency. We're really an organization that focuses on community organizing and movement building. So that's a core difference to flag. Our vision is to build a sustainable community that promotes the healthy development of youth and families, provides economic justice, and practices participatory democracy and self-determination. LVEJO's theory of social change is centered upon the belief that when low income and people of color understand the root causes of their experiences of oppression, they have the power and agency to transform society. LVEJO's grassroots organizing model is grounded in 3 guiding principles. The first is intergenerational leadership that sustains community self-determination. The second is we assume that those who are directly affected have the solutions to solve their own problems. And 3, it builds upon the existing assets and resources of the community for social change. So if you get anything out of my talk today, I'd really just want you to walk away with 2 main points. And the first is that normally the environmental movement is, when you think about environmental movement, it's oftentimes, unfortunately, not communities of color. It's unfortunately really considered a more white movement. We think of conservation efforts, which are really important, right? We think of perhaps polar bears and we think about glaciers, really important stuff, but we normally don't associate the environmental movement with communities of color. And so what I want you to walk away today is to at least understand that Little Village is a center or a hub of environmental justice and sustainable community practices led by poor and working people of color. And because of that, right, this strikes directly against the notion that poor folks are costly and undesirable populations in our society, right? That need to either be removed, eradicated, incarcerated, or displaced, right? That is a very powerful strategy of race, right? That looks at poor people as undesirable folks, when in fact, in our community, we've witnessed day by day, month by month, year by year, how poor and working folks in Little Village are actually sources of incredible knowledge, that have unbelievable skills in terms of what it means to create a more sustainable community. So in a sense, environmental justice in Little Village at its core is an anti-racist effort and initiative and movement. Does that make sense? We normally think about planners and powerful folks, think about all the time about how to move poor people around, and we at our core struggle on how we build upon that existing knowledge as really the creation of a new society that we all need, right? So that's if you can walk away thinking about Little Village as a hub of environmental justice and how it's a very important community in that sense, I would be happy with that. And then the second point that I would want you to walk away with is that we're in a crucial moment in the struggle for our city here in the city of Chicago. Right now, as we speak, folks are gathering for the Fight for 15. I don't know if there's a big rally. I'm not sure, maybe some folks are going to head over there right after this, but it's a really crucial moment in the fight for our city of Chicago on many different fronts, whether education or policing or housing or on all kinds of issues that are really super important. But the environmental justice movement has a very important role to play in the struggle for our city. And so I think that's where Kellen and I are going to try to take the conversation in the fishbowl, and how issues of water are also a crucial part of that conversation and part of that struggle. So those are the 2 points: Little Village as a hub for environmental justice, and how we're in a struggle for the city of Chicago and communities here and community rootedness, and that the EJ movement needs to be a part of that conversation. All right, so the pictures that I have rolling behind me hopefully give you a sense or a flavor or a snapshot of what I mean by Little Village and our organization as contributing to the neighborhood as a really an important place for environmental justice. And so hopefully it gives you a chance to look at young people and community leaders, and even in our office, the kinds of alternative and oppositional spaces that we open up, right? Education doesn't only happen at the university, right? It happens in a lot of different places. And our organization is committed to kind of opening up those sites and building in partnerships with folks like Rachel and Rosa and Mario to really educate community members about the work that we do. So hopefully through these photos you get a sense and say, wow, you know, the environmental movement it's right here in my neighborhood, right? The environmental justice movement is not somewhere else. I don't need to go and travel anywhere. The environmental justice movement is Pilsen. You could go right up the block now, right, and find out where that's at. It's in the south side of Chicago. It's all over. The environmental justice movement is really strong, and in Little Village, because of the work that we've been particularly involved in, it's really a core place for that. So I hope you know, as I'm talking, you kind of take a look at the pictures, and it sinks in that this is the richness of the environmental justice movement in Little Village. So I've been the ED of LVEJO for 3 years, and when I came into the organization, we were completing some really hard-fought grassroots victories. One of them being the shutdown of the 2 coal power plants here in the city of Chicago, which were considered some of the dirtiest around the country. And so the organization at that time was, you know, these were things that took 10, 15 years. So you can imagine the amount of, you know, from an organizing level, how much love, labor, blood, sweat, and tears went into this work. And so when I came into the organization, it was really about how do we complete these efforts, but also not only rest on our laurels, but try to think about, well, what is the future work that we're going to be involved in, right? What is the work that we need to commit ourselves to so that we can remain an impactful organization, but also address a number of different issues that we were continuing to find out about through our work with community leaders in the neighborhood. One of them being the Collateral Channel, which we'll focus on a little bit more. So part of the work that I've done is to say, wow, well, how do we kind of pull together the campaigns that we worked on, but also the new work that we want to get involved in? And so we went through a process really internally, about a year of really thinking hard and deeply and talking to folks about what are we going to work on as an organization? What does environmental justice look like for us? And as a neighborhood-based organization, how are we going to kind of figure this out? Because in Little Village is literally, those of you that live there, right, it's like you got everything in the neighborhood, right? You got heavy truck traffic, you have you have I-55, you have noise pollution, you have an industrial corridor right next to your neighborhood, you had a coal power plant, right? You have a lack of open space. All of these issues are in the neighborhood. We often say we don't need to go outside of our neighborhood to see really what's happening and what's happening really in frontline communities, and also to connect with things that are happening globally, right? And issues that are happening globally. We can look right in all around Little Village and be able to make those connections. So what our organization worked on was came up with an environmental justice 2020 plan, right? This is for us to think about, well, you know, where could we get to in 5 years in Little Village? What does environmental justice look like by the year 2020, right? And we started to kind of chart out different areas of our environmental justice plan. And so one of those, for example, would be energy justice or climate justice. And so we noticed that there was a lot of kind of federal policy and a lot of legislation happening currently in Illinois. Maybe, perhaps some of you are political science majors and maybe paying attention to some of that work that's happening. But trying to figure out how, oftentimes what happens is that low-income communities of color, like in Little Village, get overlooked or are not a part of the decision-making process, are oftentimes not invited or are able to influence decision-making that happens in the policy arena. So as an environmental justice organization, we now feel compelled that we actually need, in order for our communities to be protected, in order for our victories and for us to build a healthier community, we actually have to have kind of an influence at the policy level, right? That doesn't mean we want to move beyond our grassroots work. That's always the core of what we do, right? Is really like door-to-door, neighborhood-based organizing. It just means that we need to kind of be active in engaging elected officials or folks that are making decisions that are going to impact our communities, right? So that's an important piece of that, particularly around the Clean Power Plan. Currently in Illinois, there's a couple of bills that are working their way. It's like stalemated because of like the budget stuff and everything. It's really complicated, right? You can't get nothing done right now, but there's actually really important energy legislation that's going to impact all of our communities that we should be paying attention to. So in our environmental justice plan is a piece or a section that will carve out what we feel needs to be, or it needs to kind of prioritize environmental justice within policy efforts. Second piece is brownfields. So brownfield redevelopment. Anybody heard of brownfields here? So a brownfield, right? A brownfield are you know, Chicago is, we could look at our work kind of through the lens of immigration or kind of Mexican people moving to the city and then moving outwards and westward. But actually to understand kind of our work, you'd have to really think about the history of industrialization and deindustrialization right here in the city. So Chicago, always a really, really important industrial center. And unfortunately also a center of deindustrialization where a lot of factories, right, closed down and left, unfortunately left a lot of contaminated spaces. So if you go around, this is all around the city, this is not just in Little Village, but Little Village is a site where we understand from doing mapping projects that there's upwards of 600 brownfield sites just in our community, right? Where these are factories that either closed down and companies that moved away, never cleaned up, right, and left land with a lot of toxins and chemicals in them, right? So our work has been to try to come together as a community and say, well, we need to force the city or whoever was the site owners to clean up these properties, but also we want to work with community members to redevelop them or reuse these properties in ways that are going to meet the needs of neighbors themselves, right? So whether that's a community garden or right now we're working on a shared kitchen. We have a lot of street vendors in Little Village that need space to kind of prepare their foods, or even a commercial composting cooperative, right, that we're looking into. So how do we take these contaminated properties and transition them in a just manner so that they're now meeting the needs of the local residents? So a part of our sustainability plan is brownfield redevelopment. And a brownfield could be anything. Sometimes we think about like really big vacant properties, but it can actually be even a gas station or even a laundromat could be considered a brownfield because of the chemicals that they've used in their business processes. Clean water is a huge issue for us. So part of working on the new Villita Park, I'm not sure if anybody's been able to go to our new park, but it's really a wonderful space, and I hope you get a chance to go to Little Village and go to Little Village Park. It's a tremendous history. Our organization worked for years and years. It was a former Superfund site. So a Superfund is, you know, one of the highest levels of contamination, right? And this was a space right behind Cook County Jail, right, where the community had this vacant property that when it would rain, the groundwater would move into people's homes, and people would kids would get rashes, or they would play in there not really knowing what they were vulnerable to. So our organization worked for many, many years on trying to kind of raise this issue with the community, and also work with EPA or hold them accountable to and work with the city of Chicago to transform this. And just this year in July, we were able to open up a brand new 22-acre park in Little Village. So one of the reasons why this is important, and this connects to one of the other sections in our sustainability plan, which is on open space, right, is that Little Village is a very densely populated community, if you've ever been there. And it's about 100,000 or more people in kind of 5 square miles. But just to give you a sense of the desperate need for open space, the Cook County Jail is 98 acres, right? I'm sorry, 96 acres. 96 acres of land use. When we think about land committed to incarceration, right? The coal power plant that we work to shut down is 72 acres, right? 72 acres of land for the coal power plant. So prior to us working on this park, there was literally only 24 acres of open space in the community. 24 acres. And even now with the new park, right, which doubled the amount of open space in the community, that's still half the amount of space that's for incarceration, and much less amount of space that was given for the coal power plant, right? So this is what's at stake in terms of when we talk about environmental justice, when we talk about open space, and why that needs to be a part of our sustainability plan, right? And what we're working on is the need to find places for young people and families to recreate, leisure, have a moment of leisure. It's really about how we build a healthier community. All right, so in doing that work on the park, though, we found out that right across the street from the park was this heavily contaminated waterway known as the 31st Street Collateral Channel. And so neighbors around there kept telling us, man, this thing, it smells really bad. What do we do? How can we address this, right? And we kind of work with them to log, there's things you can do with EPA to kind of log the smells and try to raise this up. But other than that, a lot of folks, because industrial areas, particularly in our neighborhoods, they're oftentimes were kind of like places that people didn't go, or they were just kind of off limits, right? These industrial corridors. But now that our park is like butting against this industrial corridor, we noticed that we needed to do something about this. And this is really just a very straightforward kind of environmental injustice in our neighborhood, right? So this waterway that's right off of 31st in Albany, literally bubbles. Everybody heard of Bubbly Creek? You heard of Bubbly Creek? So we have our own Bubbly Creek. We have our own Bubbly Creek, and actually there's some pictures as you're going through that we were able to take a boat tour, and I'd never seen that. I was like really kind of devastated by it. And so we started to say, talk to the city and talk to the park district and say, how can you build a new park and have right across the street this waterway like that? This is going to really, this is something that we need to work on and address. So we've been working with the Water Reclamation District, somebody from here, and our Commissioner Shore and folks like that, and our Commissioner Frank Avila to say, how do we work on this together so that we can really take care of this, a really nasty problem in our community, but also open up the accessibility for folks to either, people don't want to swim in that, but they might want to get down and get trails and be able to to have access to these spaces that have been for decades and decades off limit to our community. So that's really our work around kind of clean water. So we don't need to go outside of our neighborhood, right? We can look at a water issue with the 31st Street Collateral Channel and say, this is how we connect with other folks who are trying, with Dr. Haverlock here and Rachel here, who are trying to think about water issues on a regional scale or even at a global level, right? And we kind of build with them by saying, well, this is what we're dealing with here in Little Village, and let's talk about this and think about what are the shared values and interests that we have. So, all right, so we got energy justice, we got brownfields, we got clean water. Riverfront redevelopment is also an important piece. Anybody been to downtown, right? The riverfront, really cool. You can kind of take a nice walk and get a bite to eat, right? Navy Pier, all that stuff. So right now what we're trying to talk about is the disparities between riverfront development either on the north side versus on the south side of the city, and also trying to think about how we do riverfront development that's not going to result in kind of condos and kind of gentrify the neighborhood, but really think about where there's spaces where industry has been so entrenched. How we think creatively about opening up these spaces for community members to have access to them, and also to think about all of the kind of creative things that we can do around riverfront development on the south side of Chicago. So one of the things that's interesting about this is that we're confronting really kind of an entrenched mentality towards planning and economic and community development that says you leave industry where it's at, right? There's really no way that community and or that this kind of environmental efforts that we're leading and industry can kind of coexist. And we're just not buying that. We actually think that right now is an important moment where we should be thinking about how the riverfront development, how the Chicago Shipping Canal, for example, we start to think about that less as the backyard of industry where they can just kind of contaminate and pollute and not be held accountable for their practices, but actually become the front yard of the neighborhood, right? In neighborhoods like Little Village, where folks have access to it. There's trails, there's walkways, there's things that we can do, and so this is really one of the kind of the main areas of contestation right now. Community visions, right? Grassroots community visions around riverfront development versus kind of like more traditional notions of community and economic development and how you manage an industrial corridor. So that's really interesting work to get involved in that we feel we need to be a part of. I mentioned about open space already with our park, right? But we're also very much focused on increasing the amount of open space in our neighborhood. So there's that area also. And then we're doing some really great work. This is actually, and there's some pictures up that are on the slideshow around, really rooted in our community garden. Anybody a gardener here? Anybody? Yeah, awesome. And you have a great garden here in UIC. So we have a wonderful community garden known as the Las Semillas de Justicia Garden, or the Seeds of Justice Garden. And that's located at 2727 South Troy. And there's a slide here that's really powerful, I think, because it shows what the space was prior to becoming a community development. So it was actually a brownfield, right? So it was, when I first started, I would go to community meetings and we would just meet right there in the neighborhood, and it was really an eyesore. It was really, kind of this vacant lot that just had, it was just really something that needed to be addressed. And so our organization worked for many years with the community who said, we want a community garden. A lot of people in our neighborhood either come from, either worked in agriculture in Mexico or have those kinds of skills and wanted to really be able to do that in Little Village where there's little opportunities to do that. And so we responded to that and created a community garden there on Troy Street. And so for the past 2 years, we've been having community potluck dinners and just inviting folks, because part of the accessibility issue is that normally a lot of times people aren't used to it or aren't, they have to like slowly become used to kind of having control over spaces, right? Where spaces are actually welcome to them. And so our organization has been doing a lot of really wonderful dinners, and it started, food is such an important way to just like bring people together. And our community garden has been such a source of community building in Little Village. And through that is really where we're starting to work a lot around food justice and zero waste, right? So food justice is really thinking about all of the issues that we need to have in terms of control over the food that we're consuming, but also on the other side, on the zero waste side, how we're not being as wasteful of a community. And we already do that a lot, right? We're already very sustainable as Latinos, as Mexicanos, we're already very sustainable in our food practices, but trying to kind of take that up a notch and thinking about composting and thinking about how we're able to kind of create these closed loop economies where we're using our food waste to create soils. We're doing worm composting in our garden with our youth leaders. There's pictures of that, right? Really cool stuff, so that we're able to really contribute to growing healthy organic foods, right? And also being less wasteful and teaching our young people about those practices, right? Or reviving those practices. So zero waste, food justice is really important for us. Clean air has become a really important issue, is always an important issue for us with the coal power plant, but it's become increasingly so because we've learned, I was mentioning to you on how our EJ victories are threatened, right? That right now we found out about an expansion project right next to Zapata Elementary, which is it's an elementary school in our neighborhood where 1,000 middle schoolers go to school, and we found out that there's a company, Unilever, actually makes Hellmann's mayonnaise. So I don't know if there's any mayonnaise people, but start eating mustard or start using mustard. That they want to expand their kind of production process right next to the school. And by their own admission are going to be requiring upwards of 500 more heavy trucks a day to be coming by the elementary school, right? And so for us, this was a really, it kind of just is, some of this stuff is just common sense, right? For us, like, how does this happen, right? How can you allow or give the green light to this type of project, right? Unfortunately, this is what we have to deal with, right? Where we need our local elected officials to be stronger on environmental justice and health, and unfortunately they're not. And so our organization has had to say, well, we worked for so many years to close down a coal power plant, and now we don't want to replace that clean air now with diesel emissions, right? And unfortunately, this is what we're dealing with, right? And so one of the things that strikes me about Little Village is just the amount of heavy trucks and diesel trucks and, coming through the neighborhood. And so we're learning a lot more now about the impact of that on our health and on children's health. So that's a major part of our sustainability plan, right? Is how we address diesel emissions, how we continue to fight for clean air, as it impacts asthma, respiratory illnesses, all of these things that we know a lot about already. Okay, and then the final piece, not the final piece, but one other major piece is youth leadership. So we don't believe you can have any kind of planning process, put any kind of like sustainability plan without thinking about how we're working with, alongside, and training young people to lead the environmental justice work that's happening in our neighborhood. And so youth leadership has always been a strong suit of our organization. Young people and students have led a lot of the research, organizing, and presentation of our work. And so our organization is committed to continuing that. We have an annual youth summit. We run a summer youth leadership program. And our strategy is really to put young people directly involved in kind of campaign organizing, so that you get that hands-on hands-on experience, and also young people are presenting back to the community about the work that they've done. So gaining all those kinds of skills to be able to be successful, whether it's in their educational careers or moving on into the workforce. So youth leadership is a major part of our sustainability plan. And then some really important work is also around the local economy, right? So there's a lot of interest in kind of what does the green economy look like? How do we kind of think about all of the job potential that exists in clean energy and wind and solar? And so we're very interested in that too. We really believe Little Village should be a community where folks can work there, right? And also participate in all of the jobs that are going to be a part of that. And we want living wage jobs. We're also interested in, I mentioned kind of a commercial composting cooperative. So people are really interested in this cooperative models. And then we would like training centers, right, where where young people from the neighborhood can get trained and also potentially find maybe advanced manufacturing jobs in our community, things like that. So sometimes what happens is in the environmental justice movement, we get pitted against kind of jobs, and that that's not true. We want jobs, we want healthy jobs for workers, we want living wage jobs, right? And we don't want workers to be vulnerable to chemicals and things like that. So in order for us to have, and again, everything that goes into a sustainability plan, you have to have, right, an economic aspect of that, a jobs section where we're trying to think really hard about that. A big piece of that will be the redevelopment of the Crawford plant, right? As I mentioned, it was 72 acres, and we really are hoping to see that space kind of transition into a campus, right? Like a multi-use campus. A lot of our community members are saying we need training centers, we need to be trained, and we want to get jobs and those kinds of things. So we'd like to see really nice open space. It's right off the riverfront, so we'd like to see open space there. We'd like to see training centers there, and even we can see maybe potentially some industry there, but of course we don't want a polluting industry to return to that site, given the work that we've done. And then climate adaptation is another section of our sustainability plan. So climate adaptation is all the work that goes into understanding how climate change is not only important in and of itself, but it actually exacerbates the types of inequalities that already currently exist in our communities, right? So we've been doing a lot of work to understand how our residents in our neighborhood are actually kind of vulnerable to energy costs, right? So whereas some communities are only spending, let's say 7 or 8% of their income on their energy bills, in our neighborhood it could be upwards of 16 to 20%, right? So when we talk about kind of displacement, right, how we're vulnerable to displacement, a lot of that is through how much poor and working people are spending, right, on basic things like their utility bills, right? So we've been doing surveying around energy and trying to think about how we work on energy efficiency in our communities, but also trying to think about the ways that energy and the cost of energy are making our community more vulnerable to gentrification and displacement. Finally, there's transit. So I mentioned we were working a lot on transit, so we're trying to think also about how we continue to build upon that work. And transportation as far as emissions and things like that is really important, so we'll be doing work around transit. And then something that I'm really excited to work on is we don't think you can have a conversation around sustainability or a healthier community without also addressing policing and criminalization. So I often tell folks when I do presentations that if you're a young person in Little Village, you would have looked at one side and seen the coal power plant, right? Really impacting negatively your neighborhood. But if you would look to the other side, you would see the Cook County Jail, right? Which is really the largest center of mass incarceration here in the city of Chicago. Not to mention that if you are undocumented, right, you're dealing with fears of your family members being deported, right, and also a lot of hyper-policing in our neighborhood. So that to us is just as toxic, right, of a situation as having a coal power plant spewing nasty stuff in the air. So that's a really exciting part of a piece of work that we're just kind of starting to kind of work on. But all of those sections together, right? And this is what I mean by when we talk about the richness and the areas of work that the environmental justice movement is taking on, issues of displacement, issues of policing, clean air, clean water, open space, right? This is everything that goes into environmental justice work, right? And so for us to put together a sustainability plan, and if we're really serious about doing that, we need to put all of those pieces of the puzzle together. And part of the reason why we're here too is we need a lot of help, right? We're only one organization, right? We need strategic partnerships. We need to work with folks at the university. We need to work with students. We need to work with city institutions, because it's going to take everybody to really implement our sustainability plan. The final thing that I'll say before we break into the fishbowl conversation is that one of the other reasons why we felt compelled to put together our own sustainability or environmental justice plan and our community rootedness plan is because we saw that there were other plans that were put in place that lacked that EJ and health perspective. So there's, in Little Village, for example, there's a quality of life plan that exists, right? It's important. There's some important things in there. And currently there's also a land use plan, right? But both of those, the quality of life plan and the land use plan, pretty much have nothing around health and environment. So what we said is, why don't we have a plan that tries to think about improving our health and environment over time? We have plans for land, we have plans for housing, we have plans for all these, for jobs, whatever it might be. Why don't we have a plan for environmental justice? Why don't we have a plan for improving our health, right? And so we felt compelled, like we needed to fill that gap. We needed to strengthen those other plans. And that's what we're committed to. So our EJ 2020 plan, then it combines our old work, right, our older campaigns, the coal power plant, the park struggle, the public bus struggle, and now these new areas of work that we're doing. And we feel that if we can accomplish this, that in 2020 we'll look at Little Village as a model community. And if we build these strategic relationships and work with folks in an ethical manner, that Little Village will be able to shine really as it already is a hub, right? Hopefully you're getting a sense from the pictures, but it will be an incredible model for not only here in the city of Chicago, but actually around the country. So I'll stop there. I hope that gives a sense of that. In the fishbowl conversation, we're going to center on the collateral channel. I talked a little bit about it, but we can dive deeper into that and hopefully get a little bit more interactive with the conversation.